Are the microphones on? Oh, they are now. Excellent. So the reporting team and I will be responding to key themes we have heard throughout the hearing. I'll be starting and then we'll just move down the line.
Thank you.
Along to my left. We have heard from a variety of submitters over the course of the 3 weeks, but there are some key themes that have come through that we wish to discuss. We heard yesterday that we did not respond to all evidence in our addendum report. I want to reassure submitters that the reporting team considered all the evidence we received. The approach that we took was that if our position in the original Section 42A hearing report did not change, we did not make a further comment in the addendum report about the evidence. Both the original Section 42A hearing report and the addendum report are the reporting team's comprehensive view of the submissions and the evidence received from the submitters. Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Incorporated provided more detail in their package of evidence, but their position on key issues has not changed from their position in their original submission. The analysis in the original Section 42A hearing report is still relevant as it analyses the issues. With regard to water quality, there was a relatively wide agreement on the water quality outcomes being sought across all the submissions, and wide acceptance that some water quality attribute states would take longer to understand fully and be met. However, Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Incorporated was seeking substantive changes to the methods used to ensure objectives could be met. Submissions by Ngāti Kahungunu were seeking a more regulatory approach to land use in order to meet objectives, and these were assessed as part of the Section 42A hearing report, the original report. With regard to the water quantity provisions, I understand that Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Incorporated is opposed to the water management regime that the reporting team supports. In particular, the reliance on mitigation measures, the actual and reasonable reallocation, and the 90 million cubic metre interim limit. Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Incorporated's evidence did not include substantively different reasons from their original submission. Therefore, we consider our analysis in the Section 42A hearing report responds to these issues. In week 1 and yesterday, we heard from submitters who thought that the plan change was amended significantly or that the plan change was refused. In the second week of the hearing and part of this week, we've heard a contrasting view from submitters that generally supported the plan change. However, they were seeking a few key amendments. Some submitters have stated that they think that the plan change is the status quo. The reporting team and I believe that proposed plan change 9 is a new approach to managing land and water resources. It responds to resource management issues in the catchments with regards to water quality and the over-allocated aquifer. Proposed plan change 9 will have immediate impact both in terms of how people value water in a limit situation where there is no more easy water and new abstraction is severely constrained, and I think we've seen this over the last few weeks. I would like to discuss how PPC 9 provides more than the Regional Resource Management Plan, as the Regional Resource Management Plan, the RRMP, is what I consider to be the status quo. Mr Black from Tito Whenua Hiratonga referred to the RRMP and the deletion of various parts of the RRMP. The RRMP provisions have been replaced by provisions that are more targeted to the tank catchments, and they provide a higher level of protection than the RRMP. Water quantity provisions in proposed plan change 9 have been developed on the basis that some water quantity areas in the tank catchment are over-allocated and that groundwater takes have stream depleting effects. The RRMP does not contain the necessary tools to effectively and efficiently address the water quantity challenges of this catchment. Under the RRMP, all water takes are permitted or assessed as a discretionary activity. The RRMP policies provide little or no guidance about reducing consented volumes or mitigating cumulative adverse effects which cannot reasonably be avoided. The plan change replaces those provisions with objectives, policies and rules which are more targeted and certain. PPC 9 sends a clear directive to decision makers and applicants that enabling over-allocation to continue or be exacerbated is unacceptable through, for example, the introduction of a prohibited activity status, reducing consented allocations according to actual and reasonable use, and reducing the volume of new permitted water takes. With regards to water quality, the plan change includes a number of provisions targeted at improving water quality that are not reflected in the RRMP. There are new requirements for freshwater farm plans, and these will result in identification of contaminant loss at a property scale and mitigation measures necessary to meet local water quality objectives. This work is directed by a priority catchment management approach targeting risk area and poor water quality areas as a priority. Action to manage diffuse contamination will not progress without PPC 9. PPC 9 further establishes baseline and target water quality at a level of detail not provided in the RMP. The transparency and clarity provided by Schedule 26 about existing and desired water quality enables better decision making about resource use, including in relation to managing discharge activities as well as diffuse contamination as a result of production land use. New stormwater management provisions in PPC 9 also remove some of the barriers to consistent and integrated management of stormwater discharges. This includes at a property scale and across urban areas. The plan change addresses legacy issues as well as providing for improved future stormwater management by Napier City Council, Hastings District Council and our Regional Council. The RRMP contains rules that prevent this integrated management, and new PPC 9 policy and rules raise the required levels of performance in respect of stormwater discharge quality management and managing risk of contamination from high-risk sites in urban areas. The RRMP seeks that there is no degradation of water quality, especially groundwater quality. The PPC 9, the plan change objectives, policies and rules, as well as the detail of Schedule 26, all seek an improved level of resource management so that not only is water quality maintained, it is also improved to meet the specified attribute states. So while the RMP was seeking there's no degradation, we're actually seeking improvement through this plan change. Proposed Plan Change 9 appropriately raises the expectation for improved management required at a property scale and through implementation of the plan change by the Regional Council and other stakeholder agencies. We are preparing a table to answer Dr. Cowie's request from yesterday. We haven't quite finished it yet, but we will get that to you on Friday. But what I have just said is a general blurb around that. Now on to freshwater management units. Ms Edmonds spoke about them yesterday, and our legal counsel has also just spoken about them. The Regional Planning Committee is determining FMUs for the region at the next committee meeting on the 7th of July. There is a process to go through that the council we're undertaking at the moment, and I believe the Regional Planning Committee is the best place to determine FMUs for the region. I note that in the definition of FMUs, which I'm just going to find so I make sure I refer to it properly. It states that the Regional Council determines FMUs. So the definition talks about an FMU means all or any part of a water body or water bodies and their related catchments that a Regional Council determines under Clause 3.8. Now if we head to 3.8, 3.81 of the MPS states that every regional council must identify FMUs for its region. Now I take that to mean that the regional council must identify the FMUs, and in the Hawke's Bay region there is a clear role for the Regional Planning Committee in determining the FMUs. I do not think that the FMUs should be determined by planning expert caucusing, which was suggested by a submitter yesterday. But I do note in 3.85b, the monitoring sites relating to Māori freshwater values must be determined in collaboration with tangata whenua. So once a FMU is determined, the council must work with tangata whenua to determine those monitoring sites. Despite PPC 9 not including FMUs, it does seek to manage fresh water at an appropriate scale for the freshwater bodies in the plan change area through the water quantity and the water quality areas. These areas allow the council to manage connected groundwater and surface water bodies within the plan change area. That's all from me. I don't know if you have any questions or if you'd like me to pass on to Ms. Robertson, who will talk about water quantity.
This is that non-complying activity status with Rule 12. Do we want to raise that? Raise it a little. Yeah.
We'll carry on.
Thank you.
So yesterday the chair asked whether setting an annual allocation through actual and reasonable, applying an actual and reasonable approach would create headroom for irrigators or other users to increase their use. And I understand the concern related to that is around the potential for a user's maximum annual use to actually become their average use. I do not consider that to be a likely outcome because there's no incentive for irrigators to pump water when there's no need. We've heard from various submitters that running irrigation is costly and it can be detrimental to the production or the health of the plant if it's applied excessively or unnecessarily. And I also think it would be irresponsible for irrigators to intensify or maximise their production within that limit in a normal year, given in a dry or drought year that they would have insufficient water to maintain their plants and their crops would die. And I'll talk about an allocation for rootstock later on, but I think that's a relevant point to keep in mind. The interim limit has been set at 90 million cubic metres based on the estimated maximum use of the 2012-2013 water year. And as demonstrated in the evidence of Dr. Kozuniak, the 2012-2013 drought is one of the years that is considered to be a 95th percentile climate event, and we've used that as a proxy for estimating the demand required to meet a 95% reliability of supply. And so while I acknowledge that stream depletion effects are occurring at existing levels of water use, I do not consider reducing allocation limits as an effective method of restoring lowland stream flows. And Mr. Rakowski has provided you some further evidence on this and is on Zoom, I believe, to talk to this further. And Pavel, I understand that there's also some matters arising from this morning that you would like to address.
Yes. So I'll start with saying that my understanding is that there appears to be an expectation that reducing the groundwater allocation to 70 million cubic meters per year would resolve stream depletion issues in lowland streams such as Poritua Kariwariwa stream in particular. So I will provide a brief summary of my evidence that is derived from modeling and also from a general hydrogeological understanding of the area to show that this reduction of allocation may not help with restoring streams to desired flows. So as you are probably aware by now, Herotanga models and modeling undertaken have shown that groundwater obstruction causes a significant flow reduction in streams and rivers in Herotanga plains. The same models were also used to explore the effects of increasing or decreasing groundwater obstruction and what effect it would have on Herotanga streams and rivers. And of course, reduction of groundwater pumping would lead to some recovery in streams, in stream flows. However, a significant recovery would require a very significant reduction. Going back to no impact natural levels would practically require a complete stop of any pumping from the Herotanga aquifer. A 20% reduction of obstruction, which would give us 70 million cubic meters per year, would be unlikely to restore the flows significantly. If we wanted to achieve desired flows in lowland streams, a significant reduction of perhaps 50% would be required. And this reduction would have to be from all water users, including public water supply. If public water supply was excluded from that reduction, the reduction for other users would have to be even higher. For example, flow in the Karamu stream was estimated to be 350 liters per second less than proposed flow maintenance trigger during the dry period 2013. To achieve this goal, a 50% reduction would have to be implemented of reduction of all takes from Herotanga aquifer, and this clearly would be very difficult to achieve. In some cases, even 50% reduction of obstruction might be insufficient to increase the stream flows to desired levels. This is the case for Naruro River, where even higher reduction would be required. So this evidence is based on modeling, but there's also other evidence that points to a difficulty of effectiveness of reduction of allocation for restoring the flows. For Paritua Kariwa stream, there is some hydrogeological evidence that this might be, in fact, very difficult. In this stream, reduction of groundwater pumping may increase flow significantly in some parts of the stream, which is part downstream of Bridgepa, which is a gaining section of the stream. However, reductions might not prevent drying of entire stream. The reason for this is because the upper section of the stream is naturally drying out when the stream enters the Herotanga plains from the higher ground and flowing over the unconfined gravels. What happens there, the stream is much higher in elevation than surrounding aquifer. So there's a gradient that pushes water down into the aquifer. And this process is unaffected by pumping. In this section of the stream, it's been measured of about 100 liters per second of water is being lost from the stream into groundwater. But this is not a result of groundwater pumping. This is just a hydrogeological setting in this area. So part of this, the lower part of the stream is affected by pumping to a significant degree, and reduction of pumping would help reduce, would help increase flows in the stream, but it might not prevent entire of the stream from getting dry. So this is why, in my opinion, a reduction of allocation by some degree, for example, to 70 million cubic meters per year is not an efficient method to achieve the trigger flows. And that's all from me.
Thanks, Pavel. Would the panel like to ask some questions?
I've just got one question, please. In your table 1, when you talk about current abstraction, what's the number you've used there, please?
I'm sorry, can I just interrupt? Mr. Rakowski, I don't know if you can see us, but we can't see you. Are you able to turn your camera on so we can see who you're talking to?
I can't, sorry.
Okay.
I thought I can turn it on, but for some reason it's not active.
Okay, that's fine.
So can you just give me that number that you mean by current abstraction in table?
Oh, here we
1?
go.
Is that
So
90 million cubes? Is it 105? Is it?
Yes, so this table 1, this is a table of scenarios that
All I'm asking is, when you say current abstraction, what number have you used there, please?
Oh yes, so this was 90 million cubic meters per year.
Thank you.
Pavel, just while we've got you on Zoom, I understand that there were some matters arising from the legal submissions from the councils this morning that you wanted to respond to? In relation to SVZs?
Regarding what, sorry? Regarding
regarding the
depletion?
We
SVZs.
were going to talk about the source protection zones later, but now that you're here and you're on screen, did you want to talk about that, if that's all right with the panel, just while we've got Mr. Rakowski on screen? Yeah. So just in response to the legal submissions from the territorial authorities this morning around source protection zones?
Yes, yes, I can do that right now. So I have read the legal submission for Hastings District Council and Napier City Council, and I disagree with some statements within it. So firstly, I disagree with the implication in paragraph 45 and 46 that the groundwater model is equally uncertain in all locations. Paragraph 46 of the legal submission includes a quote from my evidence on stream depletion discussed at paragraph 7.1. However, this quote omitted an important fragment in which I refer to a particular area in the peripheries of the Haritanga Plains in which there is a conceptual uncertainty. In general, this uncertainty is significantly lower in the main body of the aquifer, where the public water supply occurs, than in the peripheries of the aquifer, where we have more uncertainty. It is true that all models have some residual uncertainty, and this is also true for Haritanga Aquifer groundwater model. However, this uncertainty was thoroughly explored using state-of-the-art technology, namely calibration-constrained Monte Carlo analysis. This technology allows to incorporate uncertainty in the prediction by using a probabilistic but still calibration constrained modeling. And this approach was used to delineate zones of protection in Hertonga Plains. Hertonga groundwater model is in fact made of, it's not a single model, it's made of over 100 of separate groundwater models, which have different parameters. They represent slightly different flow conditions, but all these models meet calibration criteria, so they match groundwater levels and spring flows. Each of these models was used to delineate a stream depletion zone, and that way the uncertainty was represented within the modeling results. And we can explore how uncertainty affects model predictions. So the source protection zones that were delineated with this model, what they actually mean is that if there was at least one of these 100 models that predicted that a particular location, if at least one of these models predicted source protection zone to fall within this point, that's where the zone was put. So it's a very low threshold of certainty, or maybe a very high threshold of certainty. So it only needed one model to put a source protection zone in this location. For the locations that fall outside of the delineated source protection zone, it means that there was no models at all that would put source protection zone in this location. So the uncertainty, although it is present in the model, it was encompassed in the prediction itself. Secondly, I want to clarify my statement that was referred to in paragraph 47. The statement was, Mr. Rakowski describes the merging of analytical and numerical methods as unnecessarily conservative. That statement is not explained further, and I submit that it is an opinion of Mr. Rakowski, is not qualified to give and must be disregarded. So my statement was made from the technical perspective, and this statement is not there on its own. It's a conclusion that follows from the earlier paragraphs in which I gave reasons why more advanced methods produce reduced uncertainty. They are able to enable delineation of less conservative zones. So to summarize my reasoning there, in my opinion, the numerical method is more appropriate than analytical method due to multiple limitations of the analytical method. And these limitations of analytical method for source protection zone delineation mostly come down to inability of the analytical method to account for a complex groundwater flow field. Numerical method, on the other hand, is able to completely eliminate this limitation because numerical method was designed to reflect the flow field with high degree of accuracy. So in principle, analytical method has to be more conservative, typically produces a larger zone. And the reason for using a more advanced method is to limit this uncertainty and allows us for drawing a less conservative zone. So if source protection zone is derived from both analytical and numerical methods, in my view, this just goes against this principle and results in zone that is more conservative than it needs to be from the technical perspective. And yes, that's why I stated there that numerical methods, merging of these methods will produce unnecessarily conservative zone. That's all from me.
Cool. Thank you. Cool. Thank you. So turning your minds now back to water allocation and stream depletion effects. At paragraph 35, in relation to the Paritua and Kariwariwa streams in particular, Plan Change 9 recognises that this is a complex problem which doesn't have a clear-cut solution. I do not consider that setting a minimum flow and enforcing cease takes at that minimum flow would be effective or efficient methods of responding to this issue because of the evidence Mr. Rakowski has provided to us. He has identified that reducing the groundwater allocation to 70 million cubic metres per year would not restore flows in the Kiriwariwa stream to the desired effect and during the average summer periods, and certainly not during very dry summers. Pole Tank 44 reflects the complex nature of this issue by requiring further investigation, improvements to groundwater models in the Paritua area, wetland, and suggesting potential mitigation options such as riparian management, wetland creation, and provision of flows from the Ngaruroro. Submitted during week 1 indicated that Mana Whenua also have storage ideas and aspirations they would like to investigate near their marae. I consider it an appropriate change to Pole Tank 44D to include the word storage in that sentence as well to more clearly open up that opportunity. In relation to limited data and minimum flows, in week 2 we heard from submitters that the Tutaikuri minimum flow should not be increased because there was a historic instance of a ban being imposed on surface water users. As demonstrated in the memo provided by Mr. Waldron today, it is more appropriate to use models to understand and test the implications of setting or altering minimum flows rather than historic to limited data. Unfortunately, Mr. Waldron is not able to be here this afternoon, but he has prepared that memo, and the paragraphs I would specifically like to draw your attention to of his memo are on the second page under the heading Predicting Future Reliability of Water Supply. In these paragraphs, Mr. Waldron says, a record of historical abstraction restrictions is maintained by the HBRC. This record is primarily used for compliance monitoring purposes. The record can be used to help identify the extent of restriction in previous years. However, it is not suitable for use in predicting potential future restriction or reliability of water supply under different flow management regimes. It is also not suitable to use historical river or stream flow data to assess future reliability of supply under current or potential new flow management rules due to the fact these data are already affected by past abstractions from surface water and groundwater. Surface water and groundwater models are considered more appropriate tools for simulating water resources and management rules, and for predicting potential future reliability of water supply. The surface water and groundwater models that have been developed to model resources in the Tutaikuri, Ngaruroro, and Karamu Stream and Hiritunga Plains aquifer were built and calibrated using quality-assured archived monitoring data. The models were developed to incorporate the best available estimates of historical, current, and potential for future water use to simulate the surface water and groundwater resources under natural conditions and under various scenarios with current and potential alternative future water management rules. Returning back to the closing statement. So, in summary, I continue to support the Tutaikuri minimum flow being set at 2,500 litres per second based on modelling. In relation to stock drinking water, under the RRMP rules 53 and 54, permitted takes for stock drinking water uses are not limited by a quantity. Rules Tanks 7 and 8, as recommended by the Section 42A Addendum report, would enable existing takes for stock drinking water to continue unlimited while only restricting new takes and uses. Having sought advice from our consents planners, it's considered that identifying a new stock water take in use would be reliant on identifying whether the use was new, as opposed to whether the take was technically new. So related to that, I noted that in the rule cascade I provided you with the other week, I only said take, when really I should have been talking about takes and uses. So in applying this, if a farmer were to begin a water take to supply their stock drinking water in troughs that those stock previously had direct access to a stream, that would not be considered a new use and would remain a permitted activity under the RRMP conditions. That is to say, they would be unlimited by quantity. However, Rule Tank 7, which relates to surface water takes, is more stringent than Rule 54 because it applies the other permitted activity conditions, whereas under RRMP Rule 54, stock water takes were completely exempt from that rule. As discussed in the memo provided to you by Dr. Smith on the 10th of June, stock drinking water is thought to account for less than 1% of the annual average total use in the tank catchment. And as we've heard from some of the submitters during week 2 of the hearing, stock numbers in the tank catchment are decreasing and are not expected to increase. So therefore, water demand for stock drinking water is not expected to increase. Despite that, I consider it useful to retain a limit on new stock drinking water uses so that we can gain a better understanding of water demand and reflect supply constraints. Turning now to a water allocation for root stock survival. Several submitters...
Sorry, before you do, if I'm looking at tank 7, so B should be read as except 1 or 2 or 3. Is 4 intended to apply to all of those particular provisions?
My understanding is no. So 4 is for temporary uses, essentially.
Okay, so they're all alternatives, they're all
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
So returning to paragraph 42, several submitters have suggested a specific allocation of water to enable the survival of horticultural tree crops during periods where they would otherwise be subject to a ban. No submitters have provided specific information about the quantity of water that is required to enable the survival of rootstock compared to the quantity required to produce fruit. However, Ms. Sands of Horticulture New Zealand indicated that, depending on scale, 20 cubic metres per day for existing uses is likely to be sufficient. I'd also like to note that the intent of permitted rule in Tank 7 and B is intended to enable permitted activities existing at 2 May 2020 to continue taking up to 20 cubic metres per day. If a take in use for rootstock happened to be a permitted activity under the RRMP rules 53 or 54, then it would continue to be permitted. I don't assume that that would apply to all rootstock takes. Some submitters have also suggested that PPC 9 should adopt an approach similar to that provided for in the Tuki Tuki chapter of the RRMP, so that's chapter 5.9. I don't consider this appropriate because the whole water management regime for the Tuki Tuki catchment is quite different to what is being proposed for the tank catchment. The different regimes reflect the different understanding and context of hydrological connectedness, over-allocation and stream depletion effects. The relevant policy from the Tuki Tuki chapter is policy TT9. It enables takes for the survival of rootstock to be provided for as a consent condition. Takes are to be limited by a cumulative rate of take across all surface water allocation zones of 200 litres per second. The takes are limited to 5 days after a minimum flow cessation take restriction is imposed, and where no practical alternative sources of water are available or accessible. As far as I'm aware, we do not have the information to know what an appropriate rate of take limit would be across the tank catchment, or how many days would be appropriate to enable those takes to continue after a ban was imposed. So that information would be necessarily to replicate policy TT9. I do note that Plan Change 9 includes Pole Tank 51, which provides for water essential for the survival of horticultural tree crops within the priority order specified for drought events, where Council makes directions under Section 329 of the RMA. That provision is not replicated in the Tuki Tuki chapter.
Somebody had read that as a priority list. I don't read it as a priority list.
It is intended to be a priority list, and I do believe that the wording of the policy says in the following priority order. Yeah, it says to make decisions
You're quite
about...
right, my apologies,
Yeah.
thank you.
Before you go on, can you go back to your 42, paragraph 42, last sentence about Ms Sands' comment about the 20 cubic metres a day? You got, is it, as it's written there, it's 20 cubic metres per day for existing uses. Is it uses or users? Can you recall what?
I can't recall off the top of my head.
I'm just wondering if that makes it different.
Users.
Because, I mean, you say there it's existing uses, but I was wondering whether her comment there was in relation specifically to root stock survival, which is the sole use, or is it for other use? That 20 cubics is for other uses in addition to root stock survival. You might want to just check on that.
Yes, yeah, I can come back to you on that.
Thanks.
Okay. So in week 2 of the hearing, Dr. Cowie asked a question about whether the definition of actual and reasonable was unnecessary circular. So that's due to the line at the end of Part B, which says, in brackets, says, if insufficient or no accurate data is available, either clause A or C will apply. I consider that qualifier provides clear guidance to decision makers in the event that there is no water meter data, and that is to say, it's clear that if somebody doesn't have water meter data, it doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't had any use, and therefore not they don't have the ability to apply for their use to be reallocated. An example of that would be the Oderings nursery, where his consent is for 4 litres per second, and so he hasn't had a water meter.
But if you refer back to A says no more than the quantity specified on the permit due for renewal, or any less amount applied for, and the least of either B or C. So clause A just refers you back to something which says you go to B or C.
Yeah, I guess I understand why you're saying that, but I guess I'm interpreting it in the sense that somebody understands A to mean no, and therefore if your water meter data is 0, that would be less than whatever IRCalc would determine for you.
I still think it's circular, unless it's a or. Okay. I'll talk about it through at some stage.
Okay. So further on that, sufficient or accurate water meter data. Submissions from HortNZ and some other submitters sought clarity in relation to the concept of sufficient or adequate data in relation to assessing actual and reasonable use. The actual and reasonable definition allows for situations where there is insufficient or no accurate water meter data when considering existing water meter demand. And while there is no separate meaning for this, matters for discretion 1 under Rules Tank 9 and 10 provide discretion to consider actual and reasonable in light of the completeness of the water meter record, the climate record, and whether there were any water use restrictions or bans, effects of water sharing and crop rotation and development phases. This does provide decision makers discretion to assess the adequacy of the water meter record to assess actual water use need on a case-by-case basis, and enables the range of situations where water meter data is not available to be taken into account. A definition for this concept could be added to the tank glossary so that it applies as a general principle, not just in relation to a discretionary matter for a specific application. In that case, a glossary term could be worded as follows, and it's also on the TV up there, although have fun reading that, Pink.
Thank you.
So the situation where potentially useful water meter data is disregarded as a result of the whole data set being considered insufficient should be avoided. So we further recommend that it may be helpful to add at the end of clause C the following statement, that in applying the IRACALC model, the council will take into account any water meter data that is applicable. Another approach could be to compare what water data is available to the water use data for adjacent similar type uses to see if what is proposed is equitable.
Thank you.
So turning now to the issue of the recognition of existing investment. So a large number of submitters have raised concerns about the impact of reallocation according to actual and reasonable use on existing investment. And we received a wide variety of examples provided by submitters, including new crop testing and development, purchase of land with the objective of development, planned expansion of land holdings, investment into significant infrastructure that was dependent on increasing areas of crops, intensification of production from those crops, and consolidation of activities across multiple sites to one. I consider that there is a tension between PPC 9 provisions for a sinking lid approach to groundwater abstraction and the requirement under sections 104 of the RMA. So 104 2B 6 requires that decision makers have regard to planning provisions, while 104 2A requires decision makers to have regard to existing investment. Given they have the same status, I consider it would be helpful for the plan to provide some more guidance around what types of investment are considered appropriate. As mentioned, as notified, PPC 9 did enable very limited consideration of existing investment through Rule 9, matters for discretion. However, I consider this consideration is not sufficiently supported by PPC 9 policies. As a result, only takes for municipal, community or papakaiing a water supply could have their existing investment considered. So I've just briefly set out the key provisions which I consider to be in conflict, and then I talk through some options of addressing this conflict. So while the allocation regime was intended to be restrictive, the discretionary matter was supposed to provide some consideration of increased water use for existing investment within the amount originally authorised. This provision was intended to reflect the RMA provisions that allowed for consideration of existing investment in relation to reapplication of resource consents under RMA section 124. And as already mentioned, a number of submitters have also noted the RMA section 104 2A provision that requires the council to have regard to the value of the investment of the existing consent holder. And in addition, which is in addition to this that should be 104 2B 6, requirement to have regard to any relevant provisions of a plan or proposed plan. Looking at Rule Tank 9, Because of condition C of that rule, which limits irrigators to their actual and reasonable use, it can only provide to takes for municipal, community or papakainga supply under condition D. In understanding, I consider more guidance is necessary for decision making in relation to how existing investment and the associated water use can be accounted for. However, any allowance for existing investment that increases water use potentially reduces the ability of council to avoid and phase out over-allocation, and potentially increases the future costs if reducing the allocation limit is required as a result of implementing Pole Tank 42. Case law has not been particularly helpful in providing a consistent understanding of what existing investment might mean. However, several options could be considered to provide water for existing but as yet unrealised water use, including an exception within the condition, an amendment to the definition of actual and reasonable use, or consideration of increased historical use above that provided for by actual and reasonable use as a restricted, that should be discretionary activity in Rule Tank 11. This option would have to be supported by additional policy direction. The following recommendation is based on option 3. I consider that applications for increased water use above actual and reasonable use should be considered as discretionary rather than restricted discretionary. This is because of the concerns about the adverse effects of existing water abstraction, particularly groundwater use and impacts on connected surface water flows. This adverse effect, as well as a significant paper over-allocation, require a rigorous assessment of existing investment. Both options 1 and 2 could enable allocation above actual and reasonable as restricted discretionary activity. And so that's why I've discounted options 1 and 2. The changes I recommended in the Section 42A hearing report go some way to supporting option 3 by more clearly distinguishing between new allocations and reallocation. For example, the wording which I've included in Pole Tank 36F and 37D too. To fully support option 3, I consider further amendments to Pole Tank 37, Pole Tank 52 and Rule Tank 9 matters for discretion is be recommended. The intention of these additions is to narrow the scope of what uses are able to be considered and to not open the doors to every user who can demonstrate a desire to expand or intensify. So under Pole Tank, so the changes I recommend for policy 37 and 52 essentially replicate each other, and the intention is that a decision maker can take into account any water use required as part of a programmed or staged development specified within the existing water permit or associated resource consent, if all four of, well, at least the first 3, and in the case of if the specified development is intensification due to using dwarf rootstock or a crop that has a higher water demand by nature of the crop type. So those 4 are all compounding considerations, I guess. They must all be met.
Thank you.
I also recommend deleting matter 2 from Rule Tank 9. That's to close a restricted discretionary pathway for an increased allocation. A change to Rule Tank 10 is not required because the same matter for control was not replicated under that rule. And I don't think that a change to Rule 11 is required because a pathway is already provided for applications for the continuation of a previous permit which didn't meet the conditions of Rule 10, 9 or 10, as in a permit that wanted a larger amount. Another further would be a consequential amendment to RRMP Chapter 7 information requirements is also recommended to make it clear that a high bar is being set in relation to allowing for increasing water use in over-allocated tank catchments. And there I've listed some information requirements that may be a starting point for the panel's consideration.
Thank you.
I'll just have a quick drink. So turning now to water allocation for municipal supplies. As Mr. Conway mentioned, I've already provided some information about how PPC 9 treats municipal supplies in the shopping list information. After listening to Hastings District Council and Napier City Council this morning, I'll address a few aspects of the relief sought. The first is about putting a cap on the council's allocation. The second is about changing Rule 12 to a non-complying activity rather than a prohibited activity. And the third is providing for an increase in council's water allocations as a discretionary activity through Rule 11. I recognise that PPC 9 provides a stringent reallocation regime and that this will constrain the ability of the councils to obtain greater quantities of water from these catchments in the future. Council for the district and city council, in paragraph 15 of their submission, stated that the councils are not seeking free rein to unlimited water. However, based on Mr. Clue's submission, there is no sign of population growth in the Hiri-Taunga Plains slowing, and this also means that there's no sign of water demand slowing. As Ms. Chapman said this morning, urban domestic users have not previously seen a need to be efficient with their water use because they have had the perception that the resource is unlimited. I think it is appropriate to set a limit on the council's allocation to send a clear message to all water users that there is in fact a limit to the groundwater resource. As has been apparent from the range of submissions heard at the hearing, water is a valuable resource for many people and ecosystems across the tank catchment. All these people and ecosystems would enjoy more water to achieve their aspirations and thrive, and allowing any person additional water may in turn require another person to sacrifice, or environment, to sacrifice their allocation. I maintain my opinion that a prohibited status in Rule 12 is appropriate in the context of managing over-allocated water quantity areas. The risk of a non-complying activity is that it continues to enable the slow creep of individual takes with minor effects being considered on their own merits and being granted, continuing to exacerbate the impact of stream depletion in the Hiri-Taunga Plains lowland streams. As we heard from Mr. Rakowski, stream depletion effects are cumulative and the effect of municipal takes is not insignificant. Increases in the municipal allocation may have implications for the ability to address stream depletion effects. While it is theoretically possible that water will become available within the interim limit, I consider the opposite is also possible. Continuing a slow creeping increase will also increase the costs of implementing a limit under the NPS-FM 2020 in accordance with section 3.17 of that NPS. If the review of Poll Tank 42 identifies a need to set a lower total allocation limit for the Hiri-Taunga Plains groundwater. By that, I mean more users are likely to be subject to larger clawbacks. I consider it as more efficient at this stage to not allocate water than it is to allocate water and claw it back at a later date. This can, of course, be reassessed through the Kotahi plan. In relation to providing a discretionary pathway through Rule 11 for increasing council allocations, I consider that PPC 9 provides pathways for the utilisation of other sources or methods, for example storage and augmentation, which the Regional Council is already investigating. If the panel were to pursue this option, as in a discretionary pathway, I do not consider the suggested Poll Tank 37A is sufficiently restrictive. I do not agree that the matters listed A to C of that suggested policy require sufficient consideration of potential and actual environmental effects, and I have found it hard to imagine a use that does not fall within those listed 1 to 4. I have suggested additional policy considerations to support decision making regarding increasing allocation for municipal supplies would be required, which could include the following matters. So here I've listed some matters that may be considered if you were to be increasing those allocations. So the first is in relation to an event where I think the example the submitteds this morning gave was Bridge Par, where they were previously domestic uses that were supplied by their own personal bores, and so those would have been permitted takes that didn't have a permit to be transferred to the council, and therefore the first matter is whether the council would essentially be absorbing an existing use. The second is about the growth projections and the timeframes of those growth projections, and whether or not those are appropriate for the consent. Third is about efficiency of use and ensuring that the applicant has been, I guess, acting in good faith on implementing efficiency standards, and whether there's opportunity to meet the demand within further efficiency gains. The fourth is about exhaustion of other options, for example, storage and augmentation. And the fifth is about recognising the stream depleting effects of municipal takes and whether or not the applicant is proposing measures to mitigate or offset those stream depletion effects. There's not listed in a priority order or anything like that.
Just 2 comments about that. First of all, the way I read Rule 11 is that if you applied to take more water from the Hiratonga Plains groundwater, you're limited to existing use only under Rule 11, because it says does not cause the total allocation limit in the relevant quantity area as specified in Schedule 31.
Under B, it's an either or clause. So the first is for the continuation of previously authorised permits, and the second would be for a new take, and that's recognising that I think an example is the Tutaikuri River is not over allocated, and therefore there is, so that it's ensuring that.
Second issue, and I'm speaking for at least myself here, is that I'm very conscious that the case law around prohibited activities they are something that should not be contemplated under any circumstances. And I think that goes back to Coromandel Watchdog in relation to gold mining on the Coromandel. Mm-hmm. I can't see a case that additional water takes from the Hiratonga Plains aquifer are something that could not be contemplated under any circumstances. So for that reason, I at least would be leaning towards a non-complying activity status. I well understand the difficulties in that, and the difficulties in drafting provisions that would allow the door to remain ajar but not wide open, or not even slightly open, but would be interested in seeing something along those lines to give us an alternative proposition to the blanket ban in effect through Rule 12. And I recognise that other policies would need to change, like the one that says avoid in those. So can that be given some... I realise it's really hard to draft provisions that leave a door slightly ajar rather than blowing in the wind, if you like. Yeah. But if somebody could have a look at that in due course, that would be
I like to describe it as the door's closed but not locked.
Yes.
Mary Ann was just pointing out that that also applies to the surface water. It's not just the
I
groundwater.
sure appreciate that. And maybe it should be more ajar for the groundwater than the surface water. I don't know. I know the rule applies to both, and so does the other.
A bit shorter, and looking firstly to land use change and Schedule 29. So there were a large number of submitters that pointed out potential issues arising in relation to the avoid direction in Policy 21 and the controlled activity provision of Rule Tank 5. Submitters were also divided in their support between the notified version of Schedule 29 and the amended version following the Section 42A report, although I note that there was some support for the simplicity and clarity provided by the amended version. The Section 42A addendum report further suggested a nitrogen loss threshold condition of no more than 10% nitrogen loss as a result of a land use change. I don't consider that the controlled activity role is precluded by Policy Tank 21 Clause D, the avoid clause, because while nitrogen loss can be modelled at a property scale, it is much harder to assess resulting impact on the levels of nitrogen in the receiving water. Rule Tank 5 manages nitrogen loss at a property scale and, depending on circumstances, enables mitigation measures potentially at a catchment scale. While Policy 21D does set a high bar, land use change resulting in nitrogen loss can still be considered provided water quality objectives can still be met in the receiving environment. While the revised Schedule 29 in combination with Rule Tanks 5 and 6 would provide a threshold for oversight by the Council for land use change, it is based on a high level of assessment of risk of loss. I acknowledge the concerns of submitters who favour a more robust evidence-based approach, but the as-notified approach was considered to be unnecessarily complex and costly and not well supported by a range of other submitters. A number of ongoing concerns have been expressed by a number of submitters over the last 3 weeks of hearing, including in relation to impact on routine land use management and flexibility of land use, the complexity of the as-notified version, the lack of robust risk nitrogen loss assessment and lack of robust evidence to support the Section 42A version of Schedule 29, and the uncertainty as to whether a landowner met the conditions of Tank 5 and 6. The concerns about land use change rules have been wide-ranging and persistent. I therefore provide suggested following amendments to the land use change provisions for consideration, and essentially looking at inserting a new permitted activity rule that establishes the threshold of loss at 10%, an allowance for land use change of 20 hectares, provided that no more than 10 hectares of intensive winter grazing is permitted, and that holding a freshwater farm plan is a condition of the permitted activity. And further suggest that land use change be defined as a change to production land use activities that results in an increase of more than 10% nitrogen loss, as modelled by Overseer or a similar nitrogen loss budget model. And I propose that the rule and Schedule 30, which I also suggest some amendments for, is supported by guidance information about what land use changes are more at risk of leading to higher nitrogen loss. This information will be based on that currently contained in the Section 42A addendum version of Schedule 29, and I suggest that it could be further amended in consultation with industry stakeholder organisations. In addressing compliance with this rule, the Council would not expect all land use changes to require an assessment of loss change using Overseer if the risk of loss was low, according to that guidance material. And I suggest that we amend Rule Tank 5, which is a controlled activity, so that where nitrogen loss is modelled to increase by more than 10%, a land use change may be up to 10% of a property, provided the landowner is a member of a catchment collective, and the limit on intensive winter grazing of 10 hectares would still apply. And further amend tank rule 6 so that any activity not complying with the permitted activity or the controlled activity becomes a restricted discretionary activity. I suggest that we delete Schedule 29 from the plan, but insert new provisions into Schedule 30 for freshwater farm plans, catchment collective plans and industry programs as follows, so that there is a new requirement that the plan must record any land use change that is more than 20 hectares per property and which is from a lower leaching level to a higher leaching level of nitrogen loss risk, and that information is provided in the guidance information to be prepared. And the nitrogen loss risk is calculated for a change from low to high risk land use activities using overseer, and that if the land use activity results in a nitrogen loss rate of 10% or more, rules tank 5 or 6 would apply. And I also recommend the trigger for requiring assessment of land use change be increased to 20 hectares, which is in response to concerns about enabling routine land use changes within existing farm systems that was described particularly by the Federated Farmers evidence. There may be an issue of scope as this precise solution was not sought by any particular submitter. However, given the wide-ranging concerns and opposing positions in relation to the usefulness of Schedule 29, either version, I consider this solution may potentially be more acceptable and may benefit from some caucusing. If the solution is not acceptable to the Commissioners, then I would recommend amendments to Rule Tank 5 to clarify the intent to allow land use change at a property scale up to 10% of the property to be addressed by collective management, and to clarify the relationship between conditions so that any land change, so that any land use change less than 10% would be a controlled activity. In relation to Schedule 30, submissions from Hort New Zealand and Beef and Lamb seek further amendments to Schedule 30. Several of those amendments suggested provide further clarity and are accepted as reasonable, including in relation to specification of a conflict resolution process, further reporting requirements for catchment collectives where outcomes are not being achieved. Beef and Lamb submissions also suggest a new approval requirement in relation to freshwater farm plans. I'm concerned that this provision as written results in a reservation of discretion to approve a permitted activity on the basis of a value judgment by the Council. I recommend that section B 1.1 be amended instead to provide more directions as to the submission process for freshwater farm plans rather than an approval process. Looking at the Habitat Quality Index, we were asked to consider how that might look in the future plan. Forest and bird...
Ask whether it would fit or not in the planning framework.
Yeah, you don't need to read that.
Okay. We did have an opportunity to talk about the Hastings District Council evidence around stormwater and source protection zones, the minor matters that were raised. Do we have the... No. I have some written information that we can send to you later, but I could just explain what we talked about and where we agreed. Or would you rather get the written material first?
I think it's fairly thoroughly addressed in his Appendix 12 report, that Madam area.
Not the source protection zone itself, but in relation to Ms Sweeney's evidence on a number of minor matters where she was still looking for some change.
Those ones, A to T, which just
Sorry, I'm missing what you're saying. Oh, yes, absolutely.
it's getting late.
Yeah.
Quickly then?
Yes, quickly.
Okay.
But we're going to get it in writing.
Quickly then,
Thank you.
in relation to Objective 9, the evidence of Ms Sweeney that we should reinsert the reference to the management of risk to source water quality, and we're happy with that to be reinserted, and noted that we needed to amend Policy 7 as a result of introducing the source protection zones as planning maps. We can provide some text to update that policy to reflect that change. And Ms Sweeney noted the unintended implication of a couple of policies requiring a district or city plan review, and we agree that's the case. It was unintended, and would suggest a couple of amendments to reflect that it's more when reviewing district or city plans to include provisions that specify design standards for stormwater reticulation, discharge facilities, etc. So just to make it clear that we're not looking for a plan review, but to make sure that appropriate stormwater is included when they are reviewed. We agreed that the insertion of a reference to primary flow paths in Tank 21 was not necessary, and that the reference to sewage and wastewater in Rule Tank 21 for stormwater, that I agree that placing responsibility on the network manager for all domestic wastewater issues and consequently not allowing controlled status for the network was unreasonable, because it might encompass on-site domestic situations that would need to be fixed, but would be unreasonable to make it a controlled activity if that was not a controlled activity if that was occurring. However, the network operator should not be provided any opportunity for sewage discharges to be part of a stormwater network, and we suggest an alternative phrase around not including any discharge from a wastewater network or wastewater source as a condition of that rule.
Thank you.
We have one final matter of the question you asked yesterday about the resource consent rollovers.
Yes.
I can spend a minute or two discussing them. There are currently 370 consents on hold. By the end of this year, that number will have increased to 450, and by 2023 it'll be around 550. And those numbers came from the spreadsheet that Ms Robotham displayed towards the end of week 2 of the hearings.
Sorry, can you give me 370 at the moment, 450 at the...
By the end of this year,
Yep.
and 550 by the end of 2023. There are 2 consents that we have issued in the last 2 years as what we call replacements, or what Mr Black was calling rollovers. These were when people missed the Section 124 deadline, so we didn't want to let them carry on taking water once the consent was expired without issuing a new one. And these were given a consent duration of 2 years, and they expire in May 2022. And let me just find it. There were some consents rolled over in Ngātaroto in 2003. They were given a 9-year consent. There was 67 consents rolled over in 2003, and then that which was granted in 2009, and then in 2016 there was 54 consents that were rolled over, and they are due to expire in 2025.
Sorry, can you give me that last one again? Or?
There were 54 consents rolled over in 2016
Or 2016.
that are due to expire in 2025.
And they will be both for surface water and groundwater takes?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Predominantly groundwater takes, I would
Yep.
assume. Thank you.
And you'll also get that in writing as well?
Yes, I can do that, yep.
Thanks very much. Where have we got to?
Sorry, one other question. Can I just put that in context? How many consents are there in total to take water from the from the tank catchments?
From memory, from that spreadsheet, approximately 2,000.
Ms Evans, where have we got up to?
You'll see that the final remarks were from Ms Anstey with regards to stormwater. Unfortunately, she has had to leave. She was able to speak with Ms Sweeney at lunchtime. I don't think there's anything significant in those comments. They were just in relation to the oral presentation from Mr Brown yesterday. There's just a couple of areas where she's actually accepted his oral evidence as opposed to his written submission. If you'd like me to read through them, I can, or would you?
No, we'll take those as read.
Okay, thank you. So that actually concludes
Well done.
submission. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Ms Baker for providing us some suggested solutions to keep 9:30 as well. Thank you, that's very constructive.
Ooh, it feels like it's been a long day. Special greetings to those who have joined us this afternoon for that special session. This is the life. This is the unglamorous life of a hearing commissioner. I think I was talking to some family members in the weekend. They said, "Don't you lead such a glamorous life, moving from city to city in planes and moving from hotel to hotel and eating out every night?" Well, they don't get to see the other side of it when you're sitting for long periods of time. Being awake and attentive and listening very carefully to what everyone is saying, taking notes, making sure we file everything in the right place, and then giving everything due consideration, reading everything again every night, and then being back bright and early the next day. So I'd firstly like to acknowledge my co-commissioners who have sat with us over this 2.5 weeks. This is not the end of our hearings. We're going to be back in the Hawke's Bay again, so there's certainly not a poro wake as such. This is a mā te wā ka te taki tāua. We'll see each other again very shortly, but certainly I'd like to acknowledge, like Ms Edmonds has at the very start of this hearing. It was wonderful to start the hearings at the marae, and we got to hear the really strong and passionate voice of the home people. So ki te whānau o Mangaroa, he mihi kawana kia koutou, a tira kia rātou, kāore tai mai nei tēnei rā. For those who aren't able to join us during weeks 2 and 3, we still remember very well the lovely cushions we had and the little blankies, and how we were looked after during that week. So thank you very much. And certainly our second week at Toi Toi in Hastings, what a wonderful facility. It did feel that we were very far away from submitters. They were about 10 metres when we started, and by the end of the week we had them a little bit closer so we could actually see them and hear exactly what they were saying. And then this week here in Napier, thanks again to all those submitters who have come along every day, and also those who have come along and submitted and given their evidence, taken time out of their busy schedules to come and talk to us and explain their concerns and issues with us. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the council and the staff and the team, Kerry, who have been here through the whole duration. It's been really good having everybody here, even though they might not have been actively participating in what we were discussing. We could see a lot of people were in the background preparing things for today, so I certainly felt like all of the matters that we were unsure about have been catered to, and there's been good responses to our requests, no matter what they were. So thank you very much to you and to the team, and certainly not forgetting Nicola and Maggie, and it was Gavin. Was it Gavin who joined us? Who came and joined us and have been our hearing administrators. Ka nui ngā mihi kia koutou. Obviously balancing life responsibilities and being here at the hearings. Thank you very much for all your running out and getting coffees and cups of tea for us. But as you noticed during the hearing, we started out with coffees like every break, and as we've gone along we're having less and less coffee, and now we're all teetotalers because we can't get to sleep at night and we really need to get to sleep. Hoi anō, he mihi kawana kia koutou, mai te timatanga o tēnei o tātou hearings ki tēnei haura, he mihi kawana ki Ngāti Kahunu nui whanui tonu i tūtoko ana i manaki a mātou i runga tēnei huarahi. O tira he mihi kawana kia koe share i timata i tātou wāhanga i tēnei wiki, o tira ki tēnei wā te whakakapi. Nore hoi anō e tukunata rākau kia koe rauru i whakautu ngā kōrero nā te peno, nā te tepu, a kia koutou katoa.
Te rā ngā maunga whakaekea. Kukuhia kauhotia ngā awa. Whio atu te tāruki me te aho. Hutia mai te ika. Te kaura. Te tuna. Te harane. Kia ai. Kia orai te tangata. Kia orai te tangata. Tā rei rā, ka hoki aku whakaro ki te rā tuatahi. I hui ai tātou i Mangaroa. I reira me hitahi ai tātou ki a tātou. Me te kaupapa. Nāna tātou i whakawhaiti mai ki konei. Ngā awa. Ngā awa o ngā tika hungunu. E kōrero tia kenei. Ko rongo katoa ngā kōrero. Engari kara no kia oti. Kara no kia oti. Engari tēnei te mihi atu. Kia tātou katoa. Mai ia Mangaroa. Taira wātu ki tēnei whare e tūnei. Me ngā tāngata katoa i hau mai ki konei. I te whakaputa mai warātau whakaaro. Warātau kōrero. A te huri au ki wēnei tokorua e noho nei. Huia, Robert, kōrua Ngā rā katoa kei konei kōtua, kōrua. Me pare, a hako kāre i konei tarangi nei. He tū miharo tērā, he tū rangatira tērā. I te hara mai ki te whakarongo ki ngā kōrero, a koa e te haere ki hea rā no ngā kōrero. Engari ka tangi atu a hau ki a kōrua. I tai mai ia rā, ia rā, ia rā. Tā reira, koene te mihi atu ki a Ngāti Kahungunu whānui. Area mo te wehe haere i o koutou. E ware chewe tai, ka patu ahau. Engari, e tū rangatira tēnei o ngā tokorua nei. Ki te nohotahi me tātou i ngā rā katoa ko pahura kenei. Ko ina wāku nei mihi kia tātou katoa. Kare au mo te wehe haere i ngā kōrero o tērā, o tērā, o te rārana. A te wāka ki tea. A te wāka ki tea. Engari tēnei haora e te mihi kia tātou katoa. Te kauni hera, anei wā rātou kaumahi e noho nei. Ngā kauni hera katoa o tēnei rohe. Ngā kauni hera e toru i kōrero tiake nei. Tātou katoa, waku hoa e noho nei. Ia mātou e noho nei ka te whakarawa kia hau. E hoi, taumaha tēnei taonga. E waha haere nei e mātou. Engari, kia waha katoa tātou. Ka hua mā haere te haere. Reida e mihi ana kia tātou whānui huri noa. Ka re nui waku nei mihi kia tātou. Engari me ki pēnei ahau, e hara tēnei te poroporo aki. Ka no au kia hemo. Engari taiho ake aku ni pē ka hoki mai ano. Nā tunu taku kōrero karano kia oti ngā kōrero. Nā reira, ka rea mo te arawa ki weno ko te kare mohi mai ki waka kōrero. Engari ko te tū i te mihi kia tātou katoa koina te tohu. Koina te tohu. Nā reira, Pieri, tēnā koe. E waha haere nei o hoa mai. Koutou katoa. Shet, tēnā koe. E whakawāte nei a koe i te awhi mai i te hunga nei. Nara i a tātou katoa. Huri no, i te atoi a koe James e kuku mai ana. te mihi atu, kia koutou katoa, huri noa tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tagura kau taurawa ki te whare, ka ngaroa takahi te whare o te kahi katoa, hei ngau whakapai he whakapai ururo, hei hau mai nei, kei waho kei te moana, ka hore aku mi aku tangi mō koutou, maupuku ko te ka mō ai tonu te whenua e takoto nei. Nā reira runga nui ngā whakaaro i ngā take katoa ngā kaupapa i rere mai e rātau. A piti hono tātai hono, tātou tunga wairua ki a rātau. A piti hono tātai hono tātou, ngā mai huakatanga, tātou ki a tātou. Huri noa, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa.
Kainunga, kia waiho tēnā ngā kōrero ki tēnei o te mana whenua, te tāre, ngā tipārau, nā nei whako tia i tēnei wahanga papa. Nō re reko he tū tēnei, me kira he wānga he kōrero o tēnei te kaunihira aroha tamatau a māu. Mai tō tātou nei tumu whakarai e no hone. Ki te mihi ki au koutou te te pukainunga te tokarima nei. Te mihi ki au koutou te tokarima ka mihi ki au koutou hānau. E tōre ngā wiki e noho i konei rā tamatau a māu. Ko tāku aroha ke rā i o koutou hānau e tātari ana i tō i tā koutou ake whare. Me o koutou whānau e noho rā. Ka nui te mihi me kira i e nei ngā tau mahatanga e noho nei o koutou whakohinu. E pāna ki tēnei, kaore he take kai tuatu ki tēnei, ko te wai. Kai runga te ki i te mimiti haere o tēnei o ngā wai. Ka taika hoki ki tēnā e kia nei ko te mano o te wai, ka tika. Nō reira ko tāku e tū ki te mihi ki o koutou me kira ngā rangatira. E hāpai hia i ena ngā whakaro katoa, ngā kōrero katoa, e whariki hia i mua i ai o koutou aroa. E taumaha engari e tūru rangatira, e noho nā koutou. Kia kapo hia ena i ngā kōrero, kia whai hei hurahi, hei oranga mō tatau e noho ki tēnei. Kei runga i ena o ngā awa e rere hae rene. A ko tui tae puri, a ko te ahuriri, ko te karamu. Mohena i a tātou ena e kia nei ko te. Nō reira he tū tēnei kāre tōro o te tū. Hoki mai anō, hera tēnei te porapora ki te wahinga. Engari, ko tā koe aroa ki kia koe ra era. Kai hera i tō kāinga me kira kai runga te ruhuna e noho nei ki runga e te upo katei. Te whakari atara. E ho, e me kāre he kāinga kia hoki mai rā koe e me nohi konei rā. Engari e pai. Kānui te mihi. Kau toko hea i au ngā mihi kei nui a Mangaro. Kei ngā hapu a Mangaro. Nā rātou e tūwhira hia kua kina i nei e neo ngā hura he haere ai a tata. Nō reira, e te tuahine. Ai te tuakana rā. Koutou o Mangaro. Tautoko he ngā kupu. Nā koutou e whakamana hai e nei ngā kōrero te kaupapa i muarai a tātou katoa o te matau a Māui. Nō reira, i tēnā o ngā rātapu, Ko pahore ake i muri mai rā ia tata. Ko te takanga o tera. O tēnei te āhua o Matariki. A ka tuai tātou i te atapō, ai te ono o ngā karaka, ka tahi ka tukana atu ngā mate o te tāu. Ko pahore ake nei. O rea tēnei au e mihi ki a tātou nei mate. O te tau, o te marama, o te wiki o e nei rā tonu. Kia rātou kua mihia, kua tangihia. Anō reira, tēnei te mihi tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou te te pūringa. Ngā kokongoa tēnei o tā tātou i whare. Tēnā tātou.
Te ara i whanatu aira, kura koe tu mai nei, e piki ki runga, ki a marama hau, kei raro ko te matou, te wakatikanga ake ki runga rā, ka titiwha te rehutai, te ara i whanatu aira, ko te kura ki a hau, hei tohu no ake, ki te kura i te rehutai, te whakawhiti o tērā, te whakaai o whenua, o ki muri mai au ki te iwi, te ara i whanatu aira.
Ako te pito matu ki te pito matu. Te pito ora tātou ki te pito ora. Tēnā koutou, hui no tēnā tātou, ka hui ki a koe rā eche.
A e koe tutu i e kete te kāka e kūkū te keruru. A ngā mihi o te ahiahi kia koutou huri no i tō tātou nei whare a tāhua tēnā tātou. Ko te tumana ko e ora pai ana tātou katoa, anare re te whānau. Hoki pai atu koutou ki te kānga me o koutou whānau. Ko Ngāti Pārau tēnei mihi kau ana kia koutou katoa. Kei aku ranga tērā, koutou kua tai tāwhiti mai, koutou ngā kai komihana, tēnā koutou. E te whaia, e te matua, kei aku ranga tērā, te whānau o Mangaroa, tēnei te mihi nui atu kia koutou katoa. Koutou kua tai tata, koutou ngā kai mahi o te kaunihero o te matua Māui, a tēnā koutou katoa. Ko tangi te tari o te ora, nā reira. Me paku te mihi atu kia koutou katoa, kei te tautoko au ngā mihi kua mihi a nā reira. Nō ki te honere, ki te whakatau, ki te whakatūwhera, te kaupapa i tēnei wiki nā reira nāku anō te honore ki te whakakapi. Nā reira, kakara ki a tātou. Ka whakiiri a te tapu me te mauri o a tātou mahi, me a tātou kōrero, ki te hekinga o te whare nei, ki reira iri aki ai a tai hoaki kia tikinga mai anō, kia mau, kia ita, kia kore ai ngaro, kia pupuri. Tūturu o whiti whakamaua kia tīna.
Tīna.
Haumi e hui e.
Tai.
Mai e, mai e. Mai e te tipua, mai e te tāwhito. Mai e te kauhi o ngā ariki, mai e tā whiwhi kia rongo. Whakahotunuku, whakahotirangi i te manoa, ki tō mano e rongo, ko tōku mano e rongo. A tēnā ka whakiiria. Uhi wero tau mai te mauri, tūturu o whiti whakamaua kia tīna. Haumi e hui e, taiki e. Atu tera mai ngā iwi.
Tātou, tātou e.
Tōrono kei waho
Tū tēra mai ngā iwi.
Au e.
Tātou, tātou e. Whai a
Me te
Me te aroha e ngā iwi, kia tapatahi, kia kotahi rā, tātou, tātou e, tātou, tātou,
Puriti a ki a mau,
hi au wehi.
a huri no i tō tātou nei whare, a tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora.
We are adjourned.
Ko rere te kapiti.